In the last episode, we talked about allopatric speciation and a couple of forms of it. As a quick reminder,
previously on Evolution Talk.
New species originate when two populations get geographically isolated, and in this isolation there is enough genetic turnover in these populations so that eventually these two populations are so different that they react to each other as if they were two different species.
So for natural selection to have something to work with, an animal population has to first become split apart and separated from one another. For all intents and purposes, the differentiating factor between vicariance and peripatric is the size of the separated population when compared to the original population. Does it always require, say, a dramatic and insurmountable geographical barrier between the two? Well, no, it doesn't. This is where we get into two other types of speciation: sympatric and parapatric. But those we'll save for the next episode.
So that's where we are today. We are going to tackle sympatric and parapatric speciation. Let's drop the needle and get on with it.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Let's kick things off with a very brief overview. Speciation involves slow, incremental changes over time. When a group, and by group it can be anything, it can be plant, animal, insect, fish, it really doesn't matter. If there are genes in play, then speciation can occur. But anyway, when a group is separated by a geographic event, or because one group wandered far enough away that they no longer bred with the parent group, basically where gene flow between the two groups is halted, then natural selection rubs its hands together, rolls up its sleeves, and gets to work. I've said this before, and it's worth saying again. Evolution by natural selection does not have a goal in mind. It doesn't do anything with an intent on improving or perfecting an organism. There's no such thing as perfection, especially where natural selection is concerned. It's all about a genetic change that expresses itself in a way that's beneficial to the organism. It's being good enough to survive, and to do so long enough to reproduce. Now, if that mutation, because that's what we're really talking about here is a mutation, if that mutation is inheritable, then it's passed on. Over an extremely long period of time, if enough mutations accumulate that have enabled the organisms in the group to survive, they will have changed to the point where they will no longer be able to breed with the parent group. When that happens, you have a new species. Add more time to the equation, say even a few million years, and the species may continue to evolve until it looks nothing like what it did when it split from the parent group a million years before. Now, there's no way to predict some of the wonderful forms an organism will evolve into over time. It's all dependent upon random mutations and the selective pressures that the organism faces. So we covered allopatric speciation first because it's, in all honesty, the easiest one to grasp and the most common one. That's because it involves a geographic barrier to interbreeding. Now, what about those cases where speciation occurs without a geographic barrier getting in the middle of things? One way is by sympatric speciation. To say sympatric speciation isn't easy to identify would be an understatement. It's not. It's quite the opposite. What it involves is speciation without a geographical barrier to inhibit gene flow. In these instances, it could be a change of habitat where one group moves to an area, finds a food source it prefers, and stays there. The original group, not knowing about this, remains where they are. It's not like they have telephones and can call their friends to come check out the new food source.
What are you using for bait? Apple. Suppose he used a worm. The worm is in the apple. Go ahead.
I share some fancy fish.
Can't catch anything with that.
Oh, yes, you can.
Once separated, the two groups evolve over time. An example may be the orca whales in the Pacific Northwest. I say maybe because, as I mentioned, you get into some murky waters when there isn't an obvious barrier to point to. With the orcas in question, you have two groups. One is known as the transient, and the other is called the resident group. Current analysis suggests that the two groups went their separate ways around 700,000 years ago, give or take 100,000. The transient groups like to do what the name suggests. They travel around. They feed on marine mammals. The resident orca sticks close to the coastal waters where they have an abundance of saltwater salmon to fill their bellies with. Another theory for a possible cause of sympatric speciation involves sexual selection. This is even harder to identify. It basically involves a group splitting off because a few prefer a certain genetic trait that exhibits itself in a way that's appealing to some members of the group and not the others.
Haven't you ever met a man that can make you happy?
Sure. Lots of times.
This leaves us with the other one I want to take a look at today. That one is parapatric. Again, there aren't any geographical barriers. There is a barrier, but it's not uncrossable. The only thing keeping them apart is distance. The farther away the two groups are, the less likely it is they will come back together. Animals tend to mate with those closest to them, which only makes sense. How many people do you know who met in their hometown, fell in love, and spent the rest of their lives together? Now, are there examples of parapatric speciation? Well, there are, but again, it's hard to say for sure what the underlying cause initially was, especially given the thousands of years in between the time they split and today. An often cited one is another seafaring mammal, the bottlenose dolphin. Like the orca, there are different populations. One prefers the closer coastal waters, and the other prefers to hunt and live far offshore. Trying to discern what separated one group from another is a difficult game to play. Sometimes it's easy, as mentioned in the last episode with Darwin's finches. Also encountered by Darwin on the Galapagos Islands are the giant turtles. Each island's turtle sports a slightly different shell. With islands, it's easy. But it can't always be a geographical barrier given the amount of species and their different forms that surround us today. Be it allopatric, peripatric, sympatric, or parapatric, each one attempts to explain how speciation occurs. In some cases, it's a mix of all four. In others, it's an obvious divergence. In most, it's impossible to say for sure. Fortunately, we have hints as provided to us by the fossil record. It takes a lot of analysis, some detective work, and a whole lot of educated guessing to get us there.
Very effective, my dear Watson. Elementary, my dear Holmes. Elementary.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material and ways to support the show at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you, and I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.